Hey, curious minds, what if the Great Flood wasn't just a myth, but the reason Atlantis and Mu disappeared?
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into some fascinating territory, exploring these enduring mysteries of Atlantis and Mu. It seems like you listeners are really interested in lost civilizations and those big cataclysmic events.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got some interesting sources to work through. Plato, of course, but also Wikipedia entries, an article from the Times of India about Lemuria, and even a Reddit thread looking at whether Atlantis was real.
Quite a mix.
Definitely. So our mission today is to dig into all this, try to, separate the story from maybe the historical kernel, if there is one, and see if these lost worlds connect somehow to those ancient flood stories.
Sounds like a plan. Where should we start? Atlantis seems like the obvious place.
Let's do it. Atlantis, the big one. It all comes back to Plato, right?
It really does. The foundation is Plato's dialogues. Specifically, Timaeus and Critias. We're talking way back, around 360 BC.
Okay. And Plato introduces it how? Is he saying, I discovered Atlantis?
No. He has the character Critias telling a story that supposedly came down through his family from the Athenian statesman Solon, who apparently heard it from Egyptian priests.
Ah, the old story within a story device.
Yeah.
Clever. And what was this story? What was Atlantis, according to Plato or Critias?
Well, it was this incredible naval power, an island out in the Atlantic Ocean, and get this, supposedly larger than Libya and Asia together. Huge.
Wow. Okay, so massive island, powerful navy. What were they up to?
Ambition, lots of it. They apparently tried to conquer ancient Athens and, well, other parts of Europe and Asia, too. They were expanding their empire.
Sounds familiar. Hubris before the fall kind of thing.
Exactly. According to the story, the ancient Athenians managed to fight them off, which was quite a feat. But then disaster struck Atlantis itself.
The sinking part.
Right. Plato describes violent earthquakes and floods hitting the island. And it all happened incredibly fast in just a single day and night. The entire island sank beneath the waves.
Leaving behind what? Just ocean?
Well, according to Plato, it left behind this impassable, muddy shoal, making that part of the Atlantic impossible to navigate.
What a story. But you mentioned hubris. Was Plato just recording history, or was there something else going on? What do scholars think today?
That's really the key question. Most modern Plato scholars lean heavily towards it being an allegory, a philosophical tool.
An allegory for what?
For the dangers of, well, national pride, arrogance, unchecked ambition, materialism. Plato contrasts Atlantis with his idealized version of ancient Athens, which represented his ideal state from the Republic-wise, just, temperate.
So Atlantis is the bad example.
Pretty much. It's a cautionary tale. He uses these seemingly historical details, the Egyptian priests, the specific location, probably to make his philosophical point more vivid, more engaging. It wasn't necessarily meant as literal history.
That makes sense. It's a powerful way to teach a lesson.
Yeah.
But, the idea itself, this lost continent, it clearly didn't just stay a philosophical point, did it?
Oh, absolutely not. The idea of Atlantis took on a life of its own almost immediately. Interpretations have been all over the map.
Like what? Did people back then buy it as real?
Some did. There was Crantor, for instance, who was sort of a second-generation student after Plato. He apparently believed it was real, even claimed Egyptian priests confirmed it.
Interesting. But not everyone.
Definitely not. Plato's own student, Aristotle, famously dismissed it. He basically saw it as Plato's invention, pure fiction.
Okay, so divided opinions right from the start.
Oh, yeah.
What about later, like medieval times?
Yeah, it pops up in some Jewish and Christian writings then, and sometimes people started linking its destruction to the biblical flood, Noah's flood. That idea of a drowned world really resonated.
You can see why. Then the Renaissance. People started writing utopias.
Exactly. It became a useful trope. Thomas More's Utopia, Francis Bacon's New Atlantis. They use this idea of a lost, maybe perfect society somewhere out west to explore their own ideas about government and how society should work.
Right, using the myth for their own purposes. But then things took a different turn in the 19th century, didn't they, with Ignatius Donnelly?
Oh boy, did they ever. Donnelly's book, Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, was a huge bestseller. He wasn't interested in allegory. He argued Atlantis was absolutely real, a technologically advanced prehistoric civilization, the mother culture for places like Egypt and Mesoamerica.
So he took it very literally.
Yeah.
And the flood connection.
He made that explicit. He linked the sinking of Atlantis directly to the biblical Great Flood. For him, it wasn't an allegory. It was a historical catastrophe that wiped out this incredible lost world.
Wow, that must have really captured people's imaginations.
Hugely influential, and it opened the floodgates, so to speak, for other interpretations. You had Madame Blavatsky weaving Atlantis into her whole theosophical system.
Right, the esoteric stuff.
Yeah. And then figures like Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, who claimed he could access the Akashic records and gave these incredibly detailed psychic readings about life in Atlantis.
So it went from philosophy to pseudo-history and psychic visions. But where do mainstream scholars, classicists, archaeologists stand today?
The overwhelming consensus now, it's fiction. Plato's invention for philosophical purposes.
And the reasons. Besides Plato's likely intent.
Well, primarily, there's just a complete lack of credible archaeological evidence. Nothing suggests a continent-sized landmass sank anywhere in the Atlantic in geologically recent times.
With geology itself, does that support a sinking continent?
Absolutely not. Our understanding of plate tectonics just doesn't work that way. Continents drift slowly over millions of years. They don't just vanish beneath the waves in a day.
So scientifically, it's pretty much impossible on that scale and time frame.
Right. The idea of a huge landmass sinking so quickly in the Atlantic, leaving only a muddy shoal, it just doesn't fit with how we know the Earth works. Continents are buoyant, they float on the mantle, they don't just sink like a stone.
So if it wasn't real, did Plato just pull it out of thin air? Or were there maybe real events that inspired parts of the story?
That's a popular line of thought. Scholars have pointed to several possibilities. The massive volcanic eruption on the island of Thera, modern Santorini, around 1600 BC that certainly destroyed a civilization.
The Minoan connection?
Potentially, yes. Or maybe echoes of the Trojan War, or the invasion of the mysterious sea peoples around the Mediterranean. Even events closer to Plato's time, like Athens' disastrous invasion of Sicily, or the destruction of the Greek city Helike by an earthquake and tsunami in 373 BC.
So he might have borrowed elements from real disasters.
It's quite possible. He could have woven together threads from different historical events or legends to create his specific allegorical narrative.
Okay, and people have obviously tried to find it. Where have they looked? The list must be long.
Oh, incredibly long. It's almost easier to ask where people haven't looked. Lots of proposed sites are in or near the Mediterranean, which makes sense given Plato's world. Santorini, Crete, Malta, Sicily, Cyprus, maybe Tartessos in Spain.
But he said it was beyond the Pillars of Hercules out in the Atlantic.
Right, which leads to theories about the Azores or maybe a submerged island called Spartel near Gibraltar. But then you get theories placing it all over Europe, Ireland, Doggerland under the North Sea, Andalusia.
It gets even wilder, doesn't it?
It really does. Antarctica, the Caribbean, the Bahamas, theories in the Pacific, the Indian Ocean. The list goes on and on. It shows how powerful the myth is. People keep trying to map it onto the known world.
But the bottom line is,
no proposed site has ever been definitively proven to be Plato's Atlantis. Zero conclusive evidence. It remains a legend, a powerful literary creation.
okay. So Atlantis seems pretty firmly rooted in allegory and legend, despite all the searching. What about other lost lands? Our sources mentioned Mu. That sounds similar.
Similar, but also quite different in its origins. The idea of Mu as a Pacific lost continent really gets going in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Ooh.
Well, Augustus Laplanche first mentioned it, actually linking it to Atlantis initially, but it was James Churchward who really ran with it and popularized Mu specifically as a Pacific motherland. He kind of separated it out.
All right, I remember reading he connected Mu to Lemuria as well. We should probably touch on Lemuria later.
We should, yeah. Churchward claimed Mu existed in the Pacific long ago and was destroyed in a cataclysm.
And like Donnelly with Atlantis, did Churchward have his proof?
Oh, yes. He pieced together what he considered evidence from all sorts of places. He interpreted parts of the Bible, claiming Moses learned secrets from a brotherhood called the Nayakals, who supposedly came from Mu.
The Nayakals, okay.
He also used the Hindu epic Ramayana, claiming it mentioned the Nayakals coming from the east, which he took to mean the Pacific. And he heavily relied on megalithic sites in Polynesia.
Like Easter Island.
Exactly. He claimed things like the giant stone statues, the moai, and especially their top knots, the pukau, were built by the people of Mu. He said the pukau represented the sun god Ra. He basically attributed all major Polynesian megaliths to Mu.
And what happened to the people, in his view?
He argued that the present-day Polynesians were actually devolved descendants of the survivors from Mu's destruction, a rather condescending view, obviously.
Yeah. Okay, so that's Churchward's story. How does it hold up scientifically? any better than Atlantis.
Even less so, frankly. The scientific rejection of Mu is pretty total. Again, you have the issue of plate tectonics.
Right. Continents don't just sink in the middle of the Pacific.
Precisely. There's absolutely no geological evidence for a submerged continent there. The Pacific Islands we see today, they're mostly volcanic peaks built up from the ocean floor, or coral atolls built on top of sunken volcanoes. They aren't remnants of some vast sunken landmass.
And his specific claims, like about Easter Island.
Those have been thoroughly debunked. For example, the platforms the Moai stand on, the Ahu, they're mostly built right along the current coastline. If a huge continent sank, you'd expect them to be way inland or underwater, right?
Good point.
And the Triumphal Road he described, turns out it's just a natural lava flow. The Pukao, the Hats, they're made from a local red scoria, a type of volcanic rock found right there on the island, not sandstone from some distant continent.
So the evidence just doesn't support his interpretations at all.
Not in the slightest. Mu, as Churchward described it, seems to be purely a product of his imagination, weaving together disparate myths and misinterpretations.
Okay, so Atlantis, likely allegory. Mu, pseudo-scientific construct. But you mentioned Lemuria earlier, and our Times of India source brings that up. That one had a different start, didn't it? More scientific.
It did, initially. Lemuria was actually proposed in the mid-1800s by a scientist, Philip Sclater. He was a zoologist.
And he wasn't looking for lost civilizations.
No, he was trying to explain a biological puzzle. The distribution of lemurs. You find lemurs in Madagascar and related fossils in India, but nowhere in Africa or the Middle East in between.
Ah, so how did they get from one place to the other?
Exactly. Sclater hypothesized a land bridge, or even a whole continent, in the Indian Ocean that had since sunk. He called it Lemuria, after the lemurs. This was, importantly, before the theory of continental drift was accepted.
So at the time, it was a plausible scientific hypothesis to explain the lemur distribution.
Yes, it was a genuine attempt to solve a real scientific problem using the knowledge available then. And the idea gained some popularity, even among other scientists for a while, like Ernst Haeckel, who thought it might be where humans originated.
But like Atlantis, it got picked up by others too.
Oh, yes. Helena Blavatsky, again, incorporated Lemuria into her theosophical doctrines as one of the ancient root races. So it transitioned from scientific hypothesis to occult belief for some.
But then geology progressed. Continental drift became the accepted explanation for animal distribution, right?
Right. Continental drift explained how Madagascar and India were once connected as part of the supercontinent Gondwana, solving the lemur puzzle without needing a sunken continent. So the original scientific basis for Lemuria faded.
Okay, but then that Times of India article mentions a discovery in 2013, Mauritia. Does that bring Lemuria back?
Ah, Mauritia, yes, that's fascinating. Geologists found evidence tiny fragments of ancient granite and zircon crystals on the beaches of Mauritius. These minerals are typical of continental crust, not young volcanic islands like Mauritius.
So there was older land there.
It indicates there was a microcontinent, a sliver of older continental crust in the Indian Ocean. They named it Mauritia. It seems it stretched between India and Madagascar when they were separating.
And it sank.
Well, it got stretched, fragmented, and mostly submerged as the Indian Ocean basin formed. This happened a very long time ago, though. The estimates are around 84 million years ago.
84 million years. Okay, so there was land roughly where Lemuria was proposed.
Geographically, yes, there was ancient continental crust there, but the timing is the crucial part.
How so? Does it fit the lemur story?
Not at all. Mauritia disappeared, or mostly submerged, around 84 million years ago. Lemurs, as a distinct group, didn't even evolve until much later, maybe around 60 million years ago, and only reached Madagascar perhaps 54 million years ago.
Ah, so Mauritia was long gone before the lemurs ever existed, or got to Madagascar.
Exactly. So while the discovery of Mauritia is incredibly interesting geology, confirming there was indeed ancient land in that part of the Indian Ocean, it actually refutes Sclater's original Lemuria hypothesis. It doesn't support a land bridge for lemurs or anything related to recent human history.
Okay, that's a really important distinction. Real lost landmass, but totally different time scale and context from the Lemuria myth it superficially resembles.
Precisely.
So let's try and tie this back together. We started with that question. What if the Great Flood was the reason Atlantis and Mu disappeared? A striking thing across both the Atlantis and Mu stories is this theme of sudden cataclysmic destruction, floods, earthquakes.
That's definitely a powerful recurring theme, isn't it? And you see echoes of that concern in things like that Reddit discussion we looked at, where people acknowledge that real floods and disasters do bury cities.
Right, people know that happens on a smaller scale.
But the key difference here is the scale and the time frame proposed in these myths. We're talking continent-sized land masses disappearing overnight. That's vastly different from a city being flooded or buried by a volcano.
And we established Atlantis was likely Plato's allegory, not a historical account of a flood wiping out a real continent.
Correct. Although, as we saw with Donnelly later on, people definitely made that explicit link, connecting Atlantis directly to the biblical Great Flood narrative.
It seems there's just this deep psychological pull towards these stories, doesn't it? Lost golden ages, catastrophic endings.
Absolutely. They tap into something fundamental, I think. Maybe anxieties about civilization's fragility or just fascination with the mysteries of the deep past. It's remarkable how these ideas persist even without solid evidence.
But persistence doesn't equal proof. The scientific and archaeological consensus seems clear.
It does. There's just no credible evidence for Atlantis or Mu as described vast continents sinking rapidly in a global flood event in relatively recent prehistory.
And Mauritia, while real, is ancient history on a geological timescale, unrelated to these myths or human evolution in that way.
Exactly. Mauritia sank millions of years before humans, let alone lemurs in Madagascar, existed in their current form. It's geology, not myth.
Okay. So, wrapping up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways?
Well, I think it's fair to say Atlantis is best understood as Plato's philosophical allegory, a brilliant piece of writing that took on a legendary life of its own. Mu appears to be a pseudoscientific fantasy, largely constructed by Churchward.
And Lemuria started as a scientific idea, now outdated, though the discovery of Mauritia shows there was ancient land in the Indian Ocean, just not in the way the myth suggested.
Right, so Mauritia confirms lost land masses exist, geologically speaking, but it doesn't validate the specific timelines or the catastrophic flood narratives tied to Atlantis or Mu in popular imagination.
So that initial question about the Great Flood causing Atlantis and Mu to disappear, the evidence just isn't there for that specific scenario.
No, not for a single recent global flood wiping out those specific mythical continents. But the enduring power of these myths, the constant searching, the connection people make to floods and cataclysms, that tells us something profound about our fascination with loss and the mysteries buried by time.
It really does make you wonder. Maybe the flood didn't just erase history, it buried it. Until then, stay curious.